In the late autumn of 1942, a strange new fear began to ripple through the coastal towns of Connecticut. It was a fear born not of the headlines from Europe or the Pacific, but of the skies overhead. The calls began as a trickle, then became a flood into the switchboards of local police stations and military outposts, each one a new thread in a tapestry of shared anxiety. The reports were eerily consistent. It was a flying object, but unlike any aircraft they had ever seen, a bizarre silhouette against the bruised November sky. It was round, flat, almost comical in its shape, like a child's toy scaled up to an impossible size. It moved with an unnatural agility, sometimes seeming to hover almost motionless against the stiff Atlantic wind, other times climbing at an angle that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. It made a strange buzzing sound, a deep guttural thrum that was not the familiar roar of a conventional engine, a noise that seemed to vibrate in your bones. For the people of Stratford and Bridgeport, already living with the tension of wartime blackouts and the constant low-level dread of an enemy attack, these sightings were terrifying. Was it a new secret weapon from the Germans? A reconnaissance drone of some kind, launched from a U-boat lurking in the murky depths off the coast? The questions hung in the air, thick with paranoia and whispered speculation over backyard fences. Sheriff Matthew Thompson, a man whose entire career had been spent dealing with earthly problems of burglary and speeding, found himself staring at a growing pile of witness statements that sounded like something out of a Buck Rogers comic strip. He'd personally seen it one afternoon while driving his patrol car, a dark, circular shape against the gray clouds, moving in a way that made the hair on his arm stand up. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a blimp, it was something other. What Sheriff Thompson and the anxious citizens of Connecticut didn't know was that the object of their fear was indeed a secret. It was American, and it was arguably the most bizarre and revolutionary aircraft ever conceived, a machine born from the mind of a quiet genius who had dared to ask a simple question: why does an airplane need to look like an airplane? The answer to the Connecticut UFO mystery was taking off and landing just a few miles away, behind the guarded fences of the Vought Sikorsky aircraft plant. And its story was not one of alien invasion, but of a desperate search for a weapon that could conquer the most dangerous battlefield of all, the deck of an aircraft carrier. The man behind the mystery was Charles H. Zimmerman, and he was not what you would call a conventional engineer. While his colleagues at Vought were refining the elegant, deadly lines of the F-4U Corsair, with its iconic inverted gull wings, Zimmerman was sketching shapes that belonged more in a fantasy novel than on an engineering blueprint. He was a quiet, unassuming man, but behind his spectacles burned an intellect that saw the fundamental flaws in aviation design not as limitations, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. He saw airflow not as a force to be brutishly overcome, but as a medium to be finessed, to be coaxed into doing his bidding. And the deadliest puzzle of the 1940s, a puzzle written in wreckage and flame, was the aircraft carrier. To an outsider, a carrier was a symbol of immense power, a floating fortress that could project force across the globe. To a pilot, it was a terrifyingly small, pitching, rolling sliver of sovereign territory in an endless, hostile ocean. The laws of physics were in open rebellion against the concept of a carrier fighter. To be an effective combat aircraft, a fighter needed to be fast, incredibly fast, able to climb to altitude in minutes and outrun its opponents. Speed required sleek, thin wings with a low surface area to minimize drag. But to land on a carrier, that same aircraft needed to fly slowly, to approach the deck at a speed that gave the pilot a fighting chance to catch one of 3 arresting wires. Slow flight required large, broad wings that could generate enormous amounts of lift. This was the brutal compromise at the heart of every naval aircraft. They were a bundle of contradictions, forced to be both a sprinter and a marathon runner, a hawk and a hummingbird. The result was a generation of aircraft that were notoriously difficult to fly and unforgiving of the slightest mistake. A pilot approaching the deck in a Corsair was engaged in a controlled crash. He flew not by looking forward, but by craning his neck to see the landing signal officer on the deck, a tiny figure guiding him down with colored paddles. The plane would feel mushy and unresponsive, perpetually on the edge of a stall, a catastrophic loss of lift that would send the multi-ton aircraft plunging into the sea. More pilots were lost in training accidents and routine carrier operations than in actual combat. Zimmerman watched this deadly ballet of man and machine and believed there had to be a better way. He looked at the long fuselages, the slender wings, and the extended tails of conventional aircraft, and saw wasted space and unnecessary components, all contributing to drag and weight. His mind began to strip away the non-essentials. What if the wings were also the body? What if the entire aircraft was the lifting surface? He began sketching circles, ovals, and flattened discs. He was chasing an idea that had haunted aeronautical dreamers for decades: the all-wing aircraft. The theory was simple, elegant, and utterly radical. A conventional wing generates lift, but it also creates a nasty side effect at its tips. The high-pressure air underneath the wing wants to escape around the edge to the low-pressure area on top, creating a swirling vortex of air, like a miniature tornado. These wingtip vortices create a huge amount of drag, wasting engine power and making the plane unstable at low speeds. Zimmerman's genius was in his proposed solution. He envisioned a flat, semicircular aircraft body that was, in itself, a giant wing. And at the very tips of this wing, he would place two enormous propellers. These wouldn't be just for thrust, they would be an active part of the aerodynamic system. By having them rotate in opposite directions, the spinning blades would energize the airflow over the wingtips, effectively blowing those drag-inducing vortices away before they could even form. This would keep the airflow attached to the wing, even at incredibly high angles of attack and ridiculously low speeds. In theory, a plane built this way could take off in a ridiculously short distance. It could fly with a stability and control at near-zero airspeed that was simply impossible for a conventional plane. It would be, for all intents and purposes, stall-proof. And yet, it would still have the potential for high speed, as the all-wing design was inherently low drag. When Zimmerman presented his initial designs to a panel of skeptical Navy captains and Vought executives, the reactions were predictable. They looked at the drawings of a circular aircraft and saw a joke. "Charles," one vice president said, trying to stifle a laugh, "it looks like a pancake. Are we in the business of building warplanes or breakfast?" But Zimmerman was persistent, backing up his bizarre drawings with reams of wind tunnel data and complex mathematical proofs. Slowly, cautiously, the Navy became intrigued. A young, forward-thinking commander named Wallace, who had seen too many good men die in landing accidents, championed the project. The potential rewards were too great to ignore. In 1941, they awarded Vought a contract to build a proof-of-concept vehicle to test Zimmerman's radical theories. It was designated the V-173. Building the V-173 was an exercise in improvisation and unconventional thinking. To save weight and cost, this was not to be a sleek, all-metal war machine. The prototype was constructed more like an oversized model airplane. Its skeleton was a frame of steel tubing, which was then covered by a skin of doped fabric and plywood. The goal was simply to see if the thing would fly. The mechanics in the experimental hangar, men accustomed to the solid, reassuring feel of aluminium spars and flush-riveted metal, looked at the wooden frame with deep suspicion. It was powered by two small 80-horsepower Continental A80 engines, which were buried in the body of the aircraft and connected to the giant three-bladed propellers via a complex system of gears and drive shafts. The propellers themselves were enormous, over 16 feet in diameter, so large that the aircraft needed long, spindly, fixed landing gear with an almost comical praying mantis-like posture to keep them from hitting the ground. The pilot sat in a small cockpit bubble set far forward, giving him a superb view over the short, stubby nose. As the strange machine took shape, it earned its predictable nickname from the factory workers, the Flying Pancake. Others, more skeptical of Zimmerman's vision, called it Zimmerman's folly. The man tasked with the unenviable job of being its first test pilot was Boone T. Guyton, Vaught's chief test pilot. Guyton was no stranger to risk. He was the man who had tamed the notoriously wild F-4U Corsair, an aircraft that had a nasty habit of killing inexperienced pilots. But the V-173 was different. It didn't look right. It didn't feel right. It violated every instinct he had developed as a pilot. He walked around the finished prototype, a sense of profound unease settling over him. He kicked one of the tires. He ran a hand over the taut fabric skin. It felt temporary, fragile, like a child's kite. Zimmerman stood beside him, a calm presence amidst the nervous energy of the ground crew. He explained to Guyton how the plane was meant to be flown, how the collective and differential pitch of the propellers would be controlled, how it should feel on takeoff. Guyton listened patiently, nodding, but his mind was racing. Every pilot fears the unknown, and this machine was a giant, circular, fabric-covered unknown. Finally, on November 23, 1942, the day of the first flight arrived. The air was cold and still. A small crowd of engineers, Navy officials, and nervous Vought executives gathered to watch. Zimmerman gave Guyton a final, reassuring nod. Guyton strapped himself into the cockpit, went through his pre-flight checks, and started the two small engines. The giant propellers began to turn, slowly at first, then picking up speed, creating a deep, resonant hum that was utterly unique. The entire aircraft vibrated with a strange energy. He taxied out onto the runway, the strange landing gear making the plane feel awkward and ungainly. He took a deep breath, spoke a few words into his radio, and pushed the throttles forward. The response was immediate and shocking. The V-173 didn't so much accelerate down the runway as it seemed to leap into the air. The huge propellers acted like giant fans, pulling the aircraft forward and generating an immense amount of lift over the circular wing. After a ground roll of only 200 feet, a fraction of what a normal fighter would require, the Flying Pancake was airborne. Guyton's initial fear was instantly replaced by a sense of utter astonishment. The aircraft was incredibly stable. The controls, which he expected to be sluggish and heavy, were light and responsive. He made a gentle circuit of the airfield, the plane handling with a docile grace that completely belied its bizarre appearance. He experimented with its low-speed handling, throttling back, and pulling the nose up higher and higher. In a conventional plane, this would be flirting with disaster, the prelude to a stall. He could feel the familiar pre-stall buffet in his muscle memory, the slight shudder that screamed danger. But in the V-173 there was nothing. It just floated. The airflow, smoothed by the giant propellers, clung to the wing, providing solid, predictable control, even as the airspeed indicator dropped to impossibly low numbers. He realized with a shock that Zimmerman was right. The damn thing was stall-proof. After 13 minutes that felt like both a lifetime and an instant, Guyton brought the V-173 in for a landing. The approach was steep and slow, more like a helicopter than an airplane, giving him a commanding view of the runway. He touched down gently, the long landing gear absorbing the impact, and rolled to a stop in an equally short distance. As he shut down the engines and the giant propellers spun to a halt, a stunned silence fell over the airfield, quickly replaced by a spontaneous eruption of cheers. Charles Zimmerman had done it. His flying pancake was not a folly. It was a revolution. Over the next few years, Boone Guyton and other test pilots would put the V-173 through its paces in over 190 test flights, and the aircraft continued to defy expectations. Its performance was nothing short of magical. On a day with a strong headwind, pilots found they could take off with virtually no ground roll at all, lifting off almost vertically like a helicopter. They could perform maneuvers at low speed that would be suicidal in any other aircraft. The project was a stunning success, but it remained a closely guarded secret, hidden from the public eye. The only people who saw it were the anxious residents of Connecticut, who continued to report their UFOs, their stories dismissed by authorities who were in on the secret. The reputation of Zimmerman's strange aircraft began to spread through the elite circles of the aviation world. In 1944, one of the most famous aviators in history came to see the flying pancake for himself, Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh, who had become a consulting pilot for Vought, was known for his sharp, critical eye and his deep understanding of aircraft design. He was not easily impressed. He listened to Zimmerman's theories and Guyton's enthusiastic pilot reports with a cool, professional skepticism. Then he climbed into the cockpit. He flew the V-173 and was immediately converted. He found the low-speed handling to be remarkable, the stability unprecedented. He recognized the immense tactical advantage such an aircraft would have in the dangerous environment of carrier operations. His official report was glowing, lending an unimpeachable credibility to Zimmerman's radical concept. Zimmerman's design, Lindbergh wrote, represents a fundamental and desirable departure from the conventional. The low-speed characteristics are of a different order of magnitude from those of aircraft we fly today. Lindbergh's endorsement was a major victory, but it was an incident during a later test flight that would cement the V-173's legendary status. A test pilot was forced to make an emergency landing. The engines were running rough, and he knew he couldn't make it back to the airfield. He spotted a sandy beach along the coast, a perfect flat surface for a forced landing. As he descended, he realized his perfect landing strip was not as deserted as he had thought. A group of sunbathers was scattered across the sand, directly in his path. He had a horrifying choice to make: crash into the water or risk hitting the people on the beach. He chose the beach. He brought the pancake in for a perfect, slow-speed landing, touching down gently on the sand. But he was still heading directly for the bathers. His only option was to slam on the brakes hard. The effect was dramatic. The V-173's forward momentum and high center of gravity caused it to nose over violently. It flipped completely upside down, landing on its back with a sickening crunch. Rescue crews and horrified onlookers rushed to the scene, expecting the worst. They arrived to find the pilot, dazed but largely unhurt, climbing out of the inverted cockpit, and the aircraft itself, despite having cartwheeled and landed on its roof, was remarkably intact. The sturdy frame and the inherent strength of the semicircular design had absorbed the impact. It was yet another vindication of Zimmerman's unconventional design. The flying pancake wasn't just a revolutionary aerodynamic concept. It was also incredibly tough. The V-173 had been a spectacular success. It had proven, beyond any doubt, that Charles Zimmerman's theories were sound. But the wooden fabric prototype was never intended for combat. It was merely the stepping stone to the real prize, a full-fledged, all-metal, carrier-based fighter aircraft based on the same principles. This new aircraft was designated the XF-5U. If the V-173 was the quirky proof of concept, the XF-5U was the weaponized monster. It was built of an all-metal, stressed skin construction called Metalite, a Vought innovation that bonded aluminum sheets to a balsa wood core, creating a material that was both incredibly strong and lightweight. It was to be powered by two massive Pratt & Whitney R2000 radial engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower. These engines would drive the same massive articulated propellers that had been so successful on the prototype. The projected performance figures were staggering. The engineers at Vought calculated that the XF-5U would be capable of a top speed approaching 450 miles per hour, putting it on par with the fastest land-based fighters of the day, like the P-51 Mustang. Yet, thanks to Zimmerman's aerodynamic magic, it would be able to land at speeds as low as 40 miles per hour and take off in as little as 200 feet. It was to be armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, or 4 20mm cannons, giving it the punch to take on any enemy aircraft. The XF-5U was, on paper, the perfect naval fighter. It solved the fundamental contradiction of carrier aircraft. It was both a high-speed interceptor and a gentle, slow-landing pussycat. But the XF-5U, for all its promise, was a victim of its own complexity and the rapidly changing landscape of the war. The advanced gearboxes required to transfer power from the two powerful engines to the giant propellers were a constant source of trouble, causing vibrations that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. Solving these teething problems took time. The war in the Pacific was raging, and Vought's production lines were already strained, churning out thousands of Corsairs to meet the insatiable demands of the front line. The XF-5U, a high-risk experimental project, was repeatedly pushed to the back of the queue. As the project slowly moved forward, a new sound began to be heard over the airfields of Germany and England. It was a high-pitched, piercing whistle, the sound of the future. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had arrived. The jet age had begun, and with it, the death knell for advanced propeller-driven aircraft was sounded. By the time the war ended in 1945 and the XF-5U was finally ready for its first advanced taxi trials and flight tests, the world of aviation had been turned upside down. The Navy, like every air force on the planet, was now utterly captivated by the enormous potential of the turbojet engine. Jets promised speeds that no piston engine could ever hope to match. They were mechanically simpler, and they eliminated the massive, vulnerable propeller. The problems of propeller torque and vibration, which had plagued the XF-5U, were non-existent in a jet. The Navy's priorities shifted overnight. The future was not in radical propeller designs, no matter how brilliant. The future was in jets like the McDonnell F-H Phantom and the Grumman F-9F Panther. The XF-5U, a machine conceived to solve the greatest problem of the propeller era, suddenly found itself as a brilliant solution to a problem that was about to become obsolete. In 1947, after a series of successful ground tests and taxi runs that hinted at its incredible performance, the Navy officially canceled the XF-5U project. It never even made its first flight. The two prototypes that had been built were unceremoniously ordered to be destroyed. According to some reports, the airframes were so incredibly tough that the wrecking ball that was brought in to smash them simply bounced off. They eventually had to be cut apart with torches, a sad and ignominious end for what could have been the most revolutionary fighter of its time. The original V-173, the beloved flying Pancake, was spared the scrapyard. It was transferred to the Smithsonian Institution for preservation, a bizarre footnote in the history of flight. Charles Zimmerman's dream of a fleet of circular, stall-proof fighters vanished, replaced by the swept-back wings and roaring afterburners of the jet age. The story of the V-173 is a classic tale of a brilliant idea that was simply ahead of and then suddenly behind its time. It was not a failure. Every test flight, every pilot report proved that Zimmerman's unconventional theories were correct. It flew, and it flew magnificently. It remains one of aviation's most fascinating what-ifs. What if the gearbox vibrations had been solved sooner? What if it had entered service in 1944, giving American naval pilots an aircraft that could outmaneuver anything the Japanese could field, while making the terrifying prospect of a night landing on a pitching carrier deck a safe and routine affair? We will never know. The bizarre circular UFO that haunted the skies of Connecticut during the war was not a visitor from another planet. In a way, it was something far stranger. It was a visitor from an alternate timeline of aviation, a glimpse of a different path that was never taken. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most radical, most outlandish, and most brilliant ideas can be overtaken by a future that no one, not even a genius like Charles Zimmerman, could have ever seen coming.